So let's look at a couple problems where we're going to be given someone else's work and we need to figure out where they made a mistake. So for this one, Vicente tried to perform the following multiplication and reduce to lowest terms. So we're going to be multiplying these two rational expressions. And there are two options for approaching these problems. The first option is that you can just follow the work and see if you can figure out if there was a mistake or not. And the second option is to do all of the work yourself and then compare your work to their work. So we're going to look at both different methods, but for this one, we'll just go through and see if we can find the mistake. And the general strategy, remember, we're going to try to factor each of these expressions as much as possible and then essentially carry out the multiplication. So rewriting this first factor, notice we have a difference of squares up top where we have x squared minus 6 squared, or 36, and that does factor into x plus 6 times x minus 6, and our denominator doesn't factor. So that made sense. Now going to the second factor, looks like the denominator doesn't factor in this one, but the numerator, you can pull out the greatest common factor, and it looks correct as well, since if you redistribute here, you would end up with this 2x plus 6. Now the next step is to find excluded values. So which values cannot be plugged into the denominators here, or which are excluded from the domain. Since certain values, namely -3 there and -6 there, if you plug those in, you're going to end up dividing by 0. So for his work, he excluded plus or minus 6 and -3. Well, -3 is right. And we know that -6 is right, but +6 should not be excluded. And that's a common mistake, since notice if you plug in +6 there, it's going to make the numerator equal to 0. But you can always have the numerator equal to 0 as long as your denominator is some number. Since, let's say, 0 divided by 4 is just 0, or 0 divided by anything that isn't 0 is equal to 0. And that's okay. That's not going to be excluded from the domain. It's only when you're dividing by 0 that that is undefined. So the mistake is excluding +6. It should just be x cannot be equal to -6, but +6 is fine. So these questions are going to have multiple choice, so you would just find the choice where he excluded the wrong value. Or I should say he excluded an extra value. And you could continue after that just to double check, make sure that this is the only mistake. And from there, from multiplying these two rational expressions, they were factored first. We know that was correct from above. And then cancellations can be made, because notice you can cancel out the x plus 3 and the x plus 6 from top and bottom. And that's exactly what happened there. And so it looks like this last step is correct as well. And so you would just end up with this 2 and an x minus 6. So all of the work in simplifying this, these rational expressions multiplied together, the work is correct. It's just excluding this extra value that shouldn't be excluded. So let's try one more of these. And for this one, we're going to do the work ourselves and then compare that to what Adriel was able to do in his problem. So let's rewrite it. We have minus x plus 1 divided by 3x minus 6. And we're now dividing by x squared minus 1 over x plus 4. So let's start by trying to factor as much as we can. So from this first expression, you could leave it as it is, or you can try and factor out a negative. So a lot of times that's going to be helpful. So let's just pull out a negative. So you'd be left with an x. And then instead of plus 1, it will now be minus 1. And you can check that by just redistributing. And in the numerator here, notice each of these shares a common factor of 3. So we can divide each by 3, and we're left with x minus 2. And for the second expression, the one that we're dividing by, notice in the top we have a difference of squares, x squared minus 1 squared. And we can write that as a product of the first one minus the second one, now ignoring the squares, multiplied by the first one plus the second one. And of course, just like these, you can redistribute to prove to yourself that the middle terms will cancel out and you'll just get that x squared minus 1. And the denominator, it doesn't look like we can do any factoring, so let's just write it as x plus 4. Now, since everything is factored, we can change this to a multiplication problem. Since remember, if you're dividing by a fraction, it's the same as multiplying by that fraction's reciprocal. Or in other words, we are just going to change this to multiplication and flip this fraction. So you get x plus 4 up top and x minus 1 times x plus 1 down below. Now, from here, we're going to want to exclude different values of x. And for this, because it's division, you need to be careful. So first of all, let's start with that first expression. And notice in the denominator here that x cannot be equal to 2, since then you would divide by 0. And looking at the multiplication here of this second fraction, it looks like x cannot be 1 and it cannot be negative 1. And you can write that as plus 1 and minus 1 or plus or minus 1 all in one term there. Now, the tricky part is that we also need to exclude negative 4 because that's in the denominator for this fraction. We did eventually flip it over, but if you plug in negative 4, then you would be dividing by this expression here, which would be divided by 0, and that is undefined. So, like I said, we also have to exclude negative 4 from this. So in summary, whenever you're dividing by some rational expression, you need to exclude all the values of x that make either the numerator or the denominator equal to 0. Since at different points in the process of solving that, the numerator and the denominator are both at some point going to be in the denominator. And so that's why you need to make sure that neither of them can equal 0. Since before we flip the fraction, the x plus 4 is in the denominator, so x can't be negative 4. But once we flip the fraction and change it to multiplication, now this x minus 1 and x plus 1 are both in the denominator. And so if you plug in 1 or negative 1, you would again end up with some expression, now that you're multiplying by, that ends up with division by 0, which again is undefined. So we have all of our excluded values. You just need to be very careful when you're looking at division problems, since the numerator and denominator need to both be considered at different points of the problem. So now that we've excluded our values, we can make some simplifications. So notice with our product here that we can cancel out an x minus 1 in the top and down below. And that looks to be the only thing we can cancel. So we would have minus x plus 4, that negative sign would travel with us, all divided by 3 times x minus 2 times x plus 1. And you can see now why it was beneficial to factor out that negative sign in the first part of the problem. And sometimes it's not going to be helpful, but in this case it definitely was, since we had an x minus 1 in the denominator here that could be canceled out. So this would be our fully simplified fraction, and we also have all of the excluded values listed here. So let's start now going through the work and see if we can figure out where they might have made a mistake. And rewriting this first expression by factoring, you can see they did the denominator correctly, since if you redistribute, you do get 3x minus 6. But the numerator looks to be an error because we had minus parentheses x minus 1 rather than x plus 1. And you can see this is a mistake, since if you do distribute here, you would get minus x minus 1, which is not what we started with. So that looks to be the mistake, rewriting the dividend incorrectly. But if we want to double check, we can go through and look at everything else. Does look like they factored the difference of squares correctly, and they excluded plus or minus 1, negative 4, and 2. And then going through the division problem, putting in all the values that they have, even though this is not correct, we'll just assume it's okay for now just to see if everything else is right. and they changed it to multiplication. They flipped the fraction, then they canceled the x plus 1 there. And of course, we know that really it would be x minus 1, and that would be canceling this term. But if this was the actual problem, we can follow it through, and they did each step along the way correctly based on the error that they made in the beginning. So we can go look at the multiple choice. And we know it doesn't have to do with the exclusions, so it's not A or B. And he didn't rewrite the dividend correctly. The dividend, remember, is the one you're dividing into rather than the divisor, which is what you're dividing by. So for a multiple choice, we would say that he rewrote the dividend incorrectly. So that's this one.